My name is Eleanor June Mercer. I'm 36 years old, and I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, a row house 3 blocks from the Ohio River, where fog hangs over the water in late autumn and the city smells faintly of diesel and coffee. I teach middle school literature now, which is the closest thing I have to a refuge. Fluorescent lights, dog-eared copies of Salinger and Baldwin, the kind of teenagers who make you believe small gestures still matter. On the surface, my life is ordinary. Bills paid, a small kitchen that always smells like basil, a cat named Midas who judges me from the windowsill. But under that surface is a complicated map of favors, silences, and an adoption everyone in my family treated like a contract. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. They thought adoption meant control, that by signing papers and choosing my middle name, they were signing me into a tidy set of rules: allegiance, gratitude, visible obedience. My adoptive parents, Margaret and Henry Mercer, believed that love could be proven by order. They set the table the same way every night. They used the same rag to dust the mantle. They expected constancy the way other people expect church attendance on Sunday. They wanted me to be steady like their china, not something that would chip or break into sharp, inconvenient pieces. My earliest memory is of a kitchen that smelled like lemon oil and hot bread. Margaret had humanity in the way she folded towels, and Henry had a laugh that sounded like a church bell. I remember the adoption agency paper folded in the top drawer, the agency stamp like an accent of officialness. I remember the social worker's smile that tried to be both professional and maternal and smelled faintly of cigarettes. I remember lying in my adopted bed at night, the house settling around me, and thinking I could make myself small enough to fit inside the life they'd planned. But there was also a second memory stitched into the first: my biological mother's handwriting on a card they kept in a drawer labeled, "For later." Once, when I was 11, I found the card and read it. It said in a hurried script that she loved me, was sorry, and hoped I would understand. The room went cold. That cold wasn't just the winter air through the cracked window. It was the realization that a whole person had decided, silently and urgently, that losing me was the only way to survive. How do you reconcile an absence that has a name and a handwriting with a family that catalogs every birthday? If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. Growing up, Margaret taught me how to be grateful. "You were chosen, Ellie," she would say, patting the back of my head like I was a plant that needed gentle pruning. "Not everyone gets that." She tied gratitude to obedience and made it compulsory. Every major family decision, whether we would move for Henry's job, which church we'd attend during difficult years, whether I could date the boy with a chipped front tooth, was framed as a favor to the life they had built. It left me with a repertoire of thanks and the hollow taste of something I couldn't name. The house echoed with rules they disguised as values. "Respect the home," Henry would say, placing an invisible ledger on the mantel where each of my small rebellions, a different haircut, a borrowed lipstick, would be recorded. Their control wasn't brute force. It was a landscape of expectations I could navigate if I followed the map. They taught me to nod when the mayor came through for his fundraisers, to smile at the charity galas, to help myself to small sandwiched pieces of an identity that had already been decided. Yet very early I learned the arts of camouflage and economy of truth. When the church ladies asked me about my biological family, I answered with just enough to be polite. When they insisted adoption meant that I should feel privileged and indebted, I wrapped my silence like a sweater and wore it without shivering. At school I practiced smiling while keeping my throat tight, a performance that later proved useful. Teachers who never asked too much, classmates who assumed my home life was functional because it looked tidy on the outside. One winter evening when I was 15, the control turned more explicit. Margaret called me into the den with a plate of sugar cookies and sat me on the edge of her leather sofa. The TV was off, outside the trees were bare and the porch light threw a pool of yellow on the driveway. She folded her hands and said softly, "Eleanor, you have to understand something. People who have given us this life, we've been careful. We saved, we planned. There are expectations. We worry that anything out of step might jeopardize what we have." "Jeopardize how?" I asked, feeling the floor tilt under me. The cookies were dry against my teeth. Margaret looked at me the way she did when she ironed my shirts, with that quiet assessment. You represent us. You are part of a legacy, a continuation of the Mercer household. We just want willing cooperation. My body remembered the old cold again, but this time the cold came from inside. Control became more than subtle comments about the right kinds of friends. It became a polite claim on my future. It was in the way they phrased school choices, careers, even my romantic relationships. Ellie, Henry and I think becoming a teacher is practical, Margaret said once, as if making a suggestion were the same as writing a destiny. I let them think they had purchased my compliance for 2 reasons. First, because I wanted some version of peace. The alternative, constant abrasion, years of arguing over every shirt, every dinner, every word I said, seemed unbearable. Second, because I needed to keep the parts of myself that were vulnerable safe. There is a calculus that adopted children learn. Push too hard and you risk losing the thing you're living in, but bend too much and you might lose yourself. For a long time I chose to bend. But even bending leaves marks. For years I woke with my heart kicking like a trapped bird, convinced I had said something wrong at yesterday's dinner, relieved minutes later when no one called me out. I developed a ritual. In bed, lights off, I would repeat the list of what I owed them. Gratitude, obedience, silence about the card in the drawer, until sleep finally came. Sometimes I would lie there and feel a physical constriction in my ribs, as if each unspoken thing had weight and the only way to bear it was to make my body small.
Der were rewar for compliance. They loved my debut because it fit their narrative. They applauded when he took the local teaching job. They told the story of my adoption at party like a tasteful anecdote, a whitewashed origin story. In public, he was a tidy, grateful doctor. At home he was a key repository of their anxiety. People assumed control came with care and in some way it did. On night when he was too anxious to leave the house, Margaret would sit at the end of the couch and hold my hand. But the same handed comforted also traced the lines where they wanted me to be content. This is where the lie am admitting began. He let them think adoption meant my obedience. He practiced compliance like a language. He wore it in polite sentence. But underneath, in the private geography of my days, he rehearsed other lives. He read novels with protagonists who fled small towns, imagined voices of mother whose handwriting he had never fully deciphered. He collected moments of courage like pocket-sized coins, small things he could spend on himself in secret. He was not solitaire. He was learning, painfully and incrementally, that the act of being adopted did not erase the right to choose. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. Hear myself saying that now more often than I'd like, because even I tell you this you want there to be a witness. There is a kind of bravery that comes from admitting one's own contradiction. And if my contradiction helps someone feel less alone, then perhaps this confession is worth the shaking in my hand. When he left for college 2 hours away, Margaret cried like someone anti-Dalek. Henry put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Make good choice." He did make good choices and some bad ones. He fell in love with a poet who smelt of cigarette and regret. He dropped out of a graduate program he was only pretending to want. He kept letters from my biological mother folded in a box under the bed, unread for months because reading them felt like pulling a needle through a bandage. The delicate machinery of control continued to hum in the background. Calls to ask about curfews, a monthly dinner where they would meticulously inventory my life like it was a ledger. He tolerated it, and he performed the grateful child that people expected. But inside, a slow seed of rebellion not loud or spectacular, but steady started to take root. It made me keep a small pocket of myself for tomorrow. The first act of that rebellion is what I want to tell you next. How a secret letter and a late-night phone call began to change the arrangement. But before I go on, tell me, has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments, I'm reading everything.
When I call it a rebellion, people imagine shouting matches, slammed doors, visible ruptures. My rebellion was quieter. It was a series of small betrayals against an arrangement that felt like custody of my life. By the time I was 22, my life had the neat lines of a drawing. I had a classroom job, a small apartment across from a laundromat, and a carefully honed schedule. But I also had a shoebox of letters and a stubborn, dangerous curiosity. The box lived under my mattress because that was where things that might endanger my peace, or my parents' perception of me, could be hidden in plain sight. On a rain-blurred Tuesday night, I took out the letters. My biological mother, whom I had started to call on rare holidays in a way that felt like testing the temperature of the ocean, had written more frequently than I knew. Her handwriting was urgent and slanted. Sometimes the words crowded the page as if the ink were trying to outrun an ache. One letter, yellowed at the edges, said, "I had you because I loved you more than my own future. I left because I thought it would hurt less to lose you than to watch you lost to the life I could not give. They told me you would be safer. Sometimes I wonder if safety is the same as being erased." Reading that, I felt a shift in my body, like an internal compass that had been wrong all along suddenly twitching toward true north. I didn't run to my parents with it. I didn't stage a dramatic reveal. Instead, I began to fold my life into two maps. One where I complied and one where I pursued answers. If this is resonating with you, a like really helps us reach more people. I started with small inquiries. I called the social worker listed in one margin of a disrupted file I found at the county archives. A fat, yellowed binder that smelled of dust and coffee. He had retired, lived in a small bungalow down the road from the county office, and when I knocked on his door, he opened it wearing socks with tiny sailboats on them. Inside, the room smelled like newspapers and lemon. He had that gentle, patient voice of people who have handled other people's tragedies for a living. "You're Eleanor?" he asked, peering at me above his glasses. "Yes," I said. "You knew my mother." My mouth felt like cotton. He shuffled through pages and then stopped at a photocopy. "She was young," he said, voice low. "Wanted better than what she had." He told me small details. A street name, a hospital, a job at a diner. Each detail was a thread I could pull. Learning details felt like stealing, but I also felt a righteous justification. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was trying to understand myself. The research consumed my evenings. I found names, then addresses, then a social media account that I recognized because of a childhood photograph. It was like gently prying open a locked box. Sometimes the mechanism would hold, sometimes it would give with a rusty squeal. Confronting a life built by others demanded courage I had to invent on the spot. The first time I called my biological mother, the name in my head like a thing that might crack if spoken, I sat on the cold metal steps of my building and dialed, waiting for the ring to sound like an accusation. Her voice on the other end was rough and softer than I expected. "Eleanor," she said, and the name in her mouth felt like a benediction. We spoke for an hour. She told me about nights working double shifts and about an apartment with a radiator that clanged like a temper. She admitted things that I hadn't known. About debts, about a boyfriend who had been more indifferent than cruel, about a decision that had been made in a hallway at dawn. There were apologies folded into her sentences like small cloths. There was no attempt to replace what had been, only a reaching toward the thing that might have been. When I told my parents months later, the living room felt like a stage, and they were the audience watching me perform a role they had written. Margaret's face froze. Henry's jaw tightened. "Why would you reopen that?" Margaret whispered, as if reopening could let some imagined flood roll back in and erase them. "It matters to me," I said. That statement felt cinematic. It was the first time I said something to them that wasn't a reflection of their desires. They were frightened, not by the truth of my origins, but by the idea that a truth might render them unnecessary. Control isn't only about dictating. It's about ensuring indispensability. If I had parts of my life they couldn't catalogue, then their authority had a seam. The months that followed were layered with new kinds of tension. Christmas dinner became a negotiation of eyes and silent glances. My father would make a digression about stability and duty. My mother would ask about my job and press her lips in a way that looked like someone closing a door. They adjusted their rules around the fact of my curiosity as if they were taming a new pet. I alternated. I went to their charity events and smiled for the camera. I visited my biological mother's cramped apartment and helped her shop for a winter coat. The two lives were dissonant chords played on the same piano. I learned to keep my mouth steady while my chest was a blizzard. I also learned how to lie in ways that required no drama. "I'll be late to dinner," I would say, and then slip away to the diner where she worked or to a park bench where she'd wait and hands warm from a tray of coffee. There were costs. The more I knew, the more I saw the ways Margaret and Henry had rewritten narratives to make themselves the heroes. They emphasized my rescue, minimized the sacrifices that had been made by people outside their circle. It was a story that comforted them and impressed their friends, but it flattened the complexity of being an adopted child into a moral parable of salvation. One night, after a long day of grading essays and trying to simmer down a class of 7th graders who were more interested in their phones than in literature, I came home to find Margaret waiting on my porch. Her coat was too big, her breath a small cloud. She had something in her hands folded in a napkin. "Eleanor, can we talk?" she said. What followed was a longer conversation than the dinner speech I had expected. She told me about a time before me, a fear she'd carried in silence. "When we lost our first baby, I promised myself, no more loss out of my hands," she said, fingers threading through her scarf. Whether true or a constructed memory meant to justify was not the point. It explained the origin of her grip. She had become vigilant because she had learned, in the way that grief teaches, that you can never be too careful. I listened because listening was the only weapon I had that could be wielded without violence. I told her about visiting my biological mother, about the diner, about the radiator. I tried to do it gently. When I finished, Margaret's face broke in a way that was not surprise but something that looked like sorrow and then hardening, as if a sluice valve had been closed. "You could have told us," she said finally. "You could have let us be the ones to know." "I wanted to know," I said. It was the clearest truth I could offer. That night I lay awake with my palms buzzing. The house hummed with its old familiar orders, but a new current flowed under my life, a quiet insistence that I was not wholly their property. The admission that I would claim parts of myself outside their ledger was small but seismic. It meant future fights, perhaps, or a new kind of estrangement. It also meant a possibility I had been rehearsing for years, that I could hold two truths at once, that I was grateful and that I was autonomous. College taught me that being adopted created a new grammar of privacy. There were people who wanted to hear the origin story as a source of inspiration. There were others who wanted to probe, to receive permission to analyze. I became adept at controlling what to reveal, who to let into the rooms of my life where things were messy. After college, I moved back home briefly because of the practicalities of student loans and a job that paid enough to be real. The proximity was both balm and razor. Living with Margaret and Henry again meant small ritual battles. Whether the curtains were lined properly, whether the family photographs were dusted and displayed in a way that matched their sense of dignity. I oscillated between resentment and gratitude, between a desperate need for their approval and a stubborn insistence on my own narrative. If this is resonating with you, give this a like. It helps more than you know. At 28, I met Tom. He was a mechanic with a talent for fixing old VWs and a laugh so sudden it could dismantle an argument. He smelled like motor oil and rosemary. He didn't come from the sort of background that kept ledger books. He came from a family that was loud and messy and, more importantly, emotionally direct. With him, I learned that relationships didn't have to be hazardously tidy. People could say difficult things without cataloging them as moral failures. We fell into a life that felt like an experiment in being seen. For the first time, I began to recognize the patterns I had normalized. The apology on my tongue before I'd even begun to speak, the reflex to prioritize their comfort over my truth. Tom would say gently, "You don't owe them your shape." He couldn't make me less anxious about Margaret's disapproval, but he could point out the places where I was giving myself away. When I told Margaret about Tom, she smiled the way she smiled at a new chandelier. "He's fine," she said. "Stable. He'll make you happy." Her approval felt like a transaction again, a validation of her taste rather than a genuine blessing. I noticed this and ached anyway because I wanted her to be a person who could simply wish me well without measuring me against her expectations. The conflict that cracked things wide open happened at my father's funeral. Henry had been diagnosed unexpectedly with an aneurysm that unraveled our family in a single week. Graveside services are strange social mechanisms where grief is performed in columns and people choose their faces carefully. Margaret stood at the front like a conductor who expected everyone to follow her tempo. During the eulogies, someone mentioned Henry's commitment to family and duty, words that landed with proud resonance. People came up afterward with casseroles and plastic sympathy. It all felt brittle. After the funeral, a cousin pulled me aside. "You know," she said, voice low, "there were rumors about that adoption. People used to talk." Margaret was so obsessive about getting things right. The cousin's face was a soft map of her own scars. Rumors stung like sleet. That night, over the microwave hum of instant soup, Margaret said to me in a voice so thin I could see her hands shake, "People think they know us. They think you were a charity case. They don't understand what we sacrificed." "What did you sacrifice?" I asked, because there was a slow fury that had been incubating like winter seed. Margaret's reply was a list of hardships predicated on the assumption that they were the noblest actors, at all times. The tone in which she framed herself as martyr stitched a new kind of shame into me. Not shame for being adopted, but shame for challenging their chosen narrative. It felt as if my curiosity had become an affront not only to them but to their memory of Henry, who could no longer be there to defend or contradict them. I reacted in a way that surprised me. I exploded. The kitchen became an arena. "You can't keep rewriting my life to make yourselves look like saints," I said, words edged and precise. "I am not a prop. I am not a thing you rescued." Margaret's face went slack. Relief rippled through me, not because I had hurt her, but because I had finally told the truth out loud. The thing is, truth doesn't always land like a brick. Sometimes it lands like a seed that appends a garden. She retreated into silence, then said, quietly, "We just wanted to protect you." Protect me from what? From a past I didn't ask for? From the people who love me? The questions rattled like coins in a jar. After that argument, our contact cooled. We didn't shout at each other again for a long time, but there was a new distance that had weight. I felt guilty, then resolute, then strangely grateful for the space. In Courage's wake came a clarity. I had allowed them to believe adoption purchased obligation, and now I would reclaim the story. That reclamation didn't look cinematic. It involved small acts, returning a family heirloom they assumed I should keep because they didn't want to make decisions, telling my students about adoption in a way that gave nuances rather than tidy moral nutmegs, enrolling in a class about family law so I would understand the mechanics of the system that had placed me. I also began to involve my biological mother in bigger pieces of my life. I brought her to my student recital, and she clapped in a way that betrayed an earnestness no amount of shame could iron out. One unexpected thing happened. When I stopped performing gratitude on demand, my parents' friends started to ask questions. "Isn't she being ungrateful?" one neighbor whispered at a garden club meeting. The comments landed like tiny knives. I answered them with a new vocabulary. I love my parents. But love doesn't mean surrender. Tom was beside me through all of it. He explained things without grand pronouncements, offering a steady presence that didn't ask me to choose between my pasts. "They thought adoption meant control," he said once, voice even. "You let them think that long enough to survive. But you don't owe them obedience now." That sentence was both absolution and indictment. I had allowed myself to be contained to protect myself. There was no shame in that. But now survival required a different bravery. The willingness to risk their disapproval in order to be whole. It was messy. It was necessary. It would cost me things, evenings with relatives, the luxury of being the agreeable daughter at holiday dinners, but it would also give me the possibility of a life where choices felt like mine. If you're still here, thank you. Your presence is more than a metric. It's a witness. Tell me, did you ever have to choose between peace and truth? Share if it feels right. I read everything, and sometimes your words keep me going. The day my biological mother fell ill was the day the arrangement that had stood for decades showed its fault lines in a way that could no longer be ignored. She called me from a hospital bed 5 hours away, voice thin. "Eleanor, it's serious." I drove through rain and a sky that threatened to break into winter. The interstate smelled of wet asphalt and diesel. My hands cramped on the steering wheel with the urgency of someone who has been taught to arrive when people are in need. At the hospital, she looked smaller than I had expected. Machines hummed with a steady, indifferent rhythm. Her hair was a halo of gray. She held my hand the way someone holds a lifeline, as if by it she could pull herself back into coherence. "I want you to know everything," she said, "before it gets foggy." Those words set emotion into place. Over the next week, she told me a version of events that painted a fuller picture. How she had been young and overwhelmed, how the man she loved had been unreliable, how social services had pressured her with forms and choices that felt like traps. She asked questions about my life, about Margaret and Henry, about school, about my students, with a fierce curiosity that was equal parts fear and love. When I returned home from the hospital, the house felt both the same and different. I noticed the way Margaret had refolded a napkin with obsessive care, the way Henry's favorite chair sat in warm light as if waiting for him. My call with my mother unsettled the household in a way that couldn't be smoothed over by casseroles or careful courtesies. Margaret treated the illness as an inconvenience at worst and a complication at best, because complications threatened the neatness she cherished. I began to spend more time with my biological mother during her recovery. We walked the neighborhood where she used to live, the sidewalks lined with maples, and I listened as she told me about choices made under pressure. There was no attempt to rewrite. There was only an account of what survival had demanded. "We make bargains with the future," she said once, voice low. "Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. I lost you for a time, but even in that loss I kept you safe. I never pretended it was easy." Her words didn't absolve anyone. They complicated everything. They reframed my adoptive parents' control as one tactic among many to navigate loss and fear. The revelation dismantled my story into pieces that didn't fit neatly together. I began to see Margaret not solely as an oppressor and my mother not solely as a hero. Both were human, flawed and complicated, trying to make decisions in real time. There was a kind of cruel consolation in that reality. None of us was pure. If this is resonating, a like would help make sure more people hear stories like this. The fracture, however, that finally made our family confront the truth happened through something petty and public. An obituary. Margaret had organized a memorial for a distant aunt, and at the reception a woman I'd never met brought up the details of my adoption to a cluster of people, as if it were a curious addition to a menu. "Wasn't she one of the agency babies?" she asked above the clink of forks. The woman's question wasn't malicious. It was offhand, the sort of small remark people drop at communal tables to fill silence. Margaret's reaction was immediate and furious. She corrected the woman in a way that was both protective and possessive. "Eleanor is part of this family," she said loudly. "She was given to us." The phrasing, given, part of, landed like a signposting of ownership. The more Margaret insisted on the narrative of rescue, the more my biological mother's absence became an offense to her sense of dignity. I stood in the doorway with a plate of cake and felt each word like something that could cut. After the reception, I told Margaret I could no longer play the role of the grateful child on demand. The argument that followed pulled at seams that had been stitched with silence for years. It was not violent, but it was detonative. For once, everyone said things that had been simmering beneath dinners and car rides for decades. "What do you want from us?" Margaret asked, voice raw. "To be seen for myself," I replied. "Not as the project you completed, but as a person with a past that includes other people." Margaret's face crumpled. For the first time I saw not only the matriarchal veneer but the terrified woman who had once lost a baby. Her control had been an armor. Without it she was vulnerable. That realization didn't make her actions excusable, but it made them legible. The fallout has been ongoing. I don't know if reconciliation is possible in a conventional sense. Margaret and I took a hiatus from speaking for several months. Not a dramatic exile, just a measured pause that allowed both of us to breathe and to consider our edges. During that time I met with a therapist to pass the tangle of duty and autonomy. We sat in rooms that smelled like eucalyptus and furniture, and I said things aloud that I had hoarded like contraband. Saying them made them real, and real things have the inconvenient habit of affecting decisions. The most surprising moment came when Margaret left me a voicemail 6 months later. Her voice was thin. "I am trying to understand," she said. "I am scared, but I don't want to lose you." I listened to that message on the riverbank as the water moved with the lazy certainty of seasons. I realized the truth. Control and love are entangled in ways that don't allow for simple villainies. Some of the people who tried to control me were doing so because they believed it was love. That doesn't justify the control, but it recalibrates how I hold anger and forgiveness. I told her over tea in a neutral cafe that I could never be the tidy gratitude figure she wanted, but I could be present in ways that respected my agency. "You can love me without dictating my life," I said. "I will not be a mirror for your fears." It was not a reconciliation so much as a new contract forged from honesty. It had clauses. We would speak with clarity, not with passive aggression. I would be included in family decisions when relevant, but not coerced. We would acknowledge the other important people in my life. The terms were clumsy and human. The years since have been an exercise in slow repair and stubborn autonomy. Tom and I moved in together, then married in a small ceremony attended by people who loved us without conditions. My biological mother recovered enough to attend. She walked in with a cardigan that smelled of coffee and perfume and sat in the third row, clapping like anyone else. Margaret watched from the back and, for a while, looked like a woman deciding what side of a fence to stand on. She came later, bringing me a thin envelope that contained an old photograph of Henry and a note. "Forgive me my control. Love, M." That photograph, a candid shot of Henry laughing, wind in his hair, felt like an offering. Forgiveness is never clean. It is an ongoing decision. I didn't accept her control again, but I accepted the fact that we are all people who will continue to hurt and be hurt. There was an intimacy to that mutual vulnerability that felt, unexpectedly, like freedom. Over time I taught my students about families that were messy and real. I used texts that explored identity in complex ways, and I let them write themselves into narratives where no one prescribed their endings. Their essays were often messy and raw and beautiful. One of my students wrote, "My mom calls me lucky because I have both my parents. But sometimes lucky is different from chosen." I kept that sentence pinned in my desk drawer like a talisman, a reminder that luck and choice are not the same. If you're still listening, please subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Your being here matters to me. The central truth I have learned is that adoption does not equal ownership. Papers can be signed, names changed, routines established, but no legal document can manufacture identity. Identity is a messy accumulation of memories, decisions, betrayals, and reconciliations. I let my parents think their control meant everything to me for years because survival demanded it at the time. But survival does not have to be a lifetime sentence. There is a difference between surviving and living, and the latter requires claiming the right to make messy, imperfect choices. There were consequences. There were dinners I missed, calls that went unanswered for weeks, a few relatives who took Margaret's side and slid out of my life like the backs of old postcards. But there were also gains. The ability to claim my story in my own voice, the deepening of relationships that tolerated my autonomy, and a richer, more honest picture of what love can be. On the nights when old fears rise like tides and my chest tightens, I practice breathing with intention. I tell myself the whole truth. I was chosen, I was loved, some loved me imperfectly, and some choices were made for reasons I may never fully understand. I let those sentences sit without folding them into an apology. That is my small, everyday rebellion. If you take away nothing else, take this. Owning your story doesn't mean cutting people out of your life. Sometimes it means setting boundaries. Sometimes it means returning to the table and saying new things. Sometimes it means walking away. The thing that felt like a prison for years became, in time, a place where I could set a different table, one where I was invited to both sit and speak. Thank you for letting me tell you this. If something in this story landed in your chest, if it sparked something quiet and honest, please leave a comment. Has adoption been a story of control in your life, or the life of someone you love? How did you navigate it? I read every message, and your words are part of how I keep going. We thought adoption meant ownership. I let them think that until I was strong enough to say otherwise. That's not a story of blame so much as a story of learning how to be fully human in all the messy ways that requires. The lesson, finally, is this. People will try to define you. It's your job to tell them who you are, again and again, until you are believed, by yourself first, and then by those who truly love you.